Good morning, Chautauquans. Thanks for coming to our lecture this morning. I'm Bob Spiritus. I coordinate these lectures for the science group, and in coordination with Mark Wensler, we get some great speakers from the climate change initiative side. So we're happy to have you here. Grab a seat and get comfortable. And hold on to your, hold on to something because you're in for a ride. So Nik Moy here is the Conservation in Science Program Manager of the National Parks Conservation Association. He uses the GIS system and science communication techniques to advance biodiversity and land protection issues. He's helped to grow the organization's use of up-to-date fact-based resources and continues to connect the NPCA's work to the scientific community. He's played a role in tracking oil and gas leasing, air and water pollution, and wildlife movement in and around the national parks. He's building and managing NPCA's GIS program that serves as a foundational resource of data, maps, and tools for the organization. In his free time, you might find him birding, board gaming, backpacking, or biking. We're happy to have him with us, and we want to give him a Chautauqua welcome, Nik Moy.
Thanks, Bob. I hadn't heard that, but that's a great introduction. That's great. Okay. So I was going to start with this quote. Everyone holds a piece of the truth. Everyone holds a piece of the truth. Now, I actually put this up front as a disclaimer because I wanted, as I go through my talk, when you're like, Nik, that's not quite right, or you're missing a piece, I could say, I warned you. No, but seriously, I think that this quote captures the Chautauquan spirit. It captures the science group's spirit, which is that I know that each of you has experiences and stories and truths of your own, and I would love to hear those at the end. And definitely come and meet me after the talk. We can talk about it. And also in this spirit, and being in this church, reminds me of my childhood and being in church. And what we used to do is Pastor Genda would have everyone greet each other. So I'd like you to shake hands with someone that you don't know. Say your name. Tell them your favorite national park. Excellent. Okay. All right. I love how much of a community is happening right here. This is great. Okay. So before I get into telling you about the first opportunity I had to hold a piece of scientific truth, I wanted you first to think about what is it that you think about when I say the word scientist. So you close your eyes if you need to, but what do you picture? What is this scientist doing? Where are they at? What do they look like? Okay, now I have a bet, and I think there's a lot we could talk about when it comes to salient identities, about who holds power in science, but take it a little easy today, and so I've got a bet on what a couple of these things are. I bet that the scientist that you pictured had at least one of these three qualities. That maybe they're solitary, right? So someone like Jane Goodall alone in the woods in this picture up top here. Or E.O. Wilson alone studying ants out in the field. Maybe they had innate genius, someone like Einstein or Doc Brown here in the corner here. Maybe they had inspired epiphanies, right? So Neil deGrasse Tyson sitting alone and he just comes up with these ideas about black holes. Or Newton, he's sitting under a tree and the apple falls in. Boom, gravity, right? Now, I had all of these ideas myself when I was going into the science world, but the problem was that I had none of these qualities. So this is me as a 4-H kid and doing a bird presentation here. And I just like this poster. You can pull an Easter egg out of this bird's cloaca, and it has fun facts about birds inside, which is pretty cute. And you can see I won best of show, so I was pretty proud here. Thanks. But no, I was not very solitary. I was very gregarious. I didn't have innate genius. I got perfectly good grades, but I had a perfectly average IQ. And I didn't have inspired epiphanies. I generally listened to people, and I could add a little bit to the conversation. And so I used a lot of this curiosity, and I still wanted to be a scientist. And I thought maybe I would learn some of these things along the way. So after undergrad, where I studied biology, I got the opportunity to travel around and study birds. And I went to lots of migratory bird banding stations where I got to catch birds all across the country and in Canada. And you would catch them in these large nets, and you would take them out, and you could put bands on them, and you could measure them and take their blood samples, right? And I was always working with other graduate students who were asking the questions, and I was basically an unpaid intern, and I got housing, and I could go about, and I could catch birds, which is something I loved. But I wanted to ask my own questions. I wanted to have that holy grail of science, to learn something that no one ever had learned before, right? This was the idea I had in my head about science. And so I decided to go to graduate school and study this bird. Now, does anyone, I feel like we might have some birders in the audience. Does anyone know what bird this is? That's amazing. Yes. Warbler, that's great. This is a prothonotary warbler. A prothonotary warbler, yeah. It's named, it's an odd name, but it's named after, like a cardinal is named after a Catholic cardinal for its red robes. The prothonotary is named for the yellow robes of the prothonataries of the Catholic Church. So it's prothonotary warbler. And, I mean, it's an amazing bird. It's about 10 to 12 grams. You can hold it in your hand, right? It's about this big. And it's this bright golden yellow color. And it's perfectly adapted for the southeast U.S. It lives in riparian swamp habitats in the southeast. And it has this amazing ability to migrate thousands of miles to South America and back year after year, right? This tiny little bird. And so I had the opportunity to study it because, I like lots of different birds, but I found a program in Richmond, Virginia Commonwealth University, who had a long-standing prothonotary warbler study. And so it was a really cool system. They had been studying the bird since the 80s, but they put nest boxes on poles all the way down the river, hundreds of them. And they have holes that are perfectly sized for prothonotary warblers, so it's the only bird that'll nest there. And it's cool, you can canoe right up to the nest boxes, and you can open them up, and you could put a net over the hole, and if there's a female sitting on the eggs, it would fly right into the net, right? So you could measure them and take their feathers, and you could open the box, and you could count the eggs, and you could see the nestlings. So it was a really great study system, almost like the lab mouse of migratory birds. And so I went to work there thinking that I didn't have any, I wasn't an expert on the prothonotary warbler. I didn't have that innate genius, but that there was a system ready for me. And I also found that this lab had been doing all sorts of really cool research, had been having all of these scientific discoveries. The lab that I went to, they had put little geolocators, these little backpacks on the prothonotary warblers, and they could track where this specific population was going in South America for the first time. They also had discovered that the males would come back to their breeding grounds early, and those that came back early would fight for the best nest boxes. And the ones that fought for the best nest boxes got the best food, and they would have the brightest feathers. And so they were measuring that for the first time, bright yellow feathers on the strongest males, right? They also found out, this lab found out that the females weren't as seasonally monogamous as they had originally thought. They did genetics and found out that a lot of the babies were from other fathers, which is pretty interesting. So I was coming into this lab sort of an imposing situation and trying to figure out what I could bring to the table. And one of my, I think, qualities was that I could hang out with anybody. And so I was hanging out in the ecology department, and I could hang out with the bird folks who are sort of like the colorful oddballs, but I could also hang out with the fish guys, and they're ichthyologists, very smart, but they're also kind of rednecks, you know what I mean? They're fishermen, And then I can also hang out with the entomologists, right, who are like, the nerds of the ecology department, super nerdy. And so while I was hanging out with all these different groups, I was coming up with a question. And I thought I could use the project that the Bird Lab was working on, right, this long-standing system. I could look at the bugs that the entomology department was studying. So the mayflies that were coming off of the river, the caterpillars in the trees. And the fish lab was starting to look at this algal bloom that was happening in the James River outside of Richmond. And you might be familiar with some of these algal blooms, but this one, like many, is growing in size because of various over-nutrification. So it could be from sewage runoff out of the city, or it could be fertilizer that's coming off of the farm fields that's creating the algal blooms. They cause lots of problems, but this one in particular created a toxin that was getting into the blue crab and the fish. And so the fish lab was tracking this. This is important. People eat these things. And so I came up with this question, and I worked for several field seasons with lots of individuals from all of these labs, brought people together around this project. And in the end, after several seasons of mosquito bites and sunburn and flipping the canoe over many times, and we finally had held a piece of that scientific truth for the first time. So there's a lot of data on this one, but I want you just to focus in on this part of the graph here, which is, for the first time, we showed that the algal bloom toxin was getting into the aquatic mayflies, right? So this is what the mayflies look when they live a large portion of their life underwater. Those mayflies emerged, and they brought with them the toxin, which we hadn't known before. And then various things like these spiders and the birds would eat them. And we found that the birds that were feeding their nestlings the most aquatic food, the most mayflies, over terrestrial food like caterpillars, that they were getting the most toxin. And so I had the opportunity to present this to the scientific community. We got to publish in several papers, and it was well received by the scientific community. And I felt like for the first time I got to hold that holy grail of science, right? This thing that no one else had ever held before. Now, I also got to present this to my parents. These are my parents. And my mom works at the local Ace Hardware store. My dad is a mail carrier in the Chicago suburbs. And, so the science is sort of new to them, but I like to use them as a gut check. And so I asked my mom, I was like, what'd you think? She said, so the warbler is not endangered? I was like, no, not really. That's why it's a good study species, She said, so why does it matter? And so, she's like, what? So, like, are you going to fix the algal problem, right? And so it's like, I was about to go on a whole science, as a scientist now, and I was going to tell her that, the march of science and the importance of small steps, and it's not the role of the scientist to fix the problems, it's just the role of the scientist to ask the questions. But instead I paused, and I thought, what, she's right. How could I connect science to solving the problems of conservation? And so I started back at the beginning thinking, maybe I had just bitten off too small a piece of the truth. That if I wanted to have bigger answers, I would need to ask bigger questions. Now, I also, at the time, the only way I knew how to do that was with bigger data. And so, you might not be familiar, but there's a census that happens around the US for figuring out where all of the plants and animals are across the country. And it's a really amazing effort. It takes hundreds of biologists across thousands of work hours, and they're out there in canoes catching birds, and they're on cliff sides identifying new plant species, and they're in the labs looking at insects, right? So this is happening all over, but they're doing this with a standard methodology, and so it's happening at universities and DNRs, right? but they're using it all using the same standard methodology. And that methodology is called the NatureServe Network. And this is a group that brings all those data together to ask those big questions that I wanted to ask. It asks things like, where are the species? How many are there? And how are they doing? And so I went and worked for them and found that they were doing science, quite like I had thought about science. And it turns out that it wasn't about individual scientists who were going out and finding that one species, but it was many, many people in a large network that was able to ask these questions. They were using collaboration, and it took lots of hard work, from lots of people. For me, it wasn't as much sunburn and mosquito bites this time. It was sitting in front of spreadsheets. But for the first time, they could, and at this specificity, they could create this map. That is the map of biodiversity importance. So for several years, they came out with this. And this is a really cool example of a single map that shows so much data, right? There's thousands and thousands of hours poured into this. There's hundreds and hundreds of species that are represented here, and this shows where the biodiversity that's most at risk is across the country. So we could see that for the first time with this data set. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? This is a gigantic database where we could understand things about all different species. And you'll see throughout the talk that I'll go more into some of those other types of data. Now, when you start to collect this level of data, you can also start to have some summary statistics. And so this is the most up-to-date. This came out this year in a new NatureServe report. But we found that 34% of plant species are at risk of extinction. That 40% of animal species are at risk of extinction in the US, and 41% of American ecosystems are at risk of collapse. It was sort of my first time engaging with these data and doing the math for myself. And we hear a lot about climate change and many of the other difficulties we're facing, but this was my first time engaging with the biodiversity crisis. This is the results of the 6th mass extinction. So if you haven't heard this term before, scientists believe that we're currently in the midst of the 6th mass extinction. The 6th being that 5 others have happened on this planet, the last of which was the way of the dinosaurs, right? And that we're currently in this one. The difference between this one and the last one is it's not a meteor that's causing it, it's humankind, right? It's mainly development and the destruction of habitat, but it's also invasive species and is compounded by climate change. While I was at NatureServe, I had the opportunity to meet E.O. Wilson, and something that he talks about is this 6th mass extinction, and that we cannot survive without these ecosystems, that this level of collapse means human extinction, period. That's what the science says. That we use these ecosystems for our food, for our clean water, for medicine, for the air that we breathe. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir. I know that you folks know this, right? That we are so reliant on these ecosystems for our survival. And so I got to meet E.O. Wilson while I was there, and he's a big advocate of NatureServe. As I mentioned him before in the talk, he's an ant biologist and ecologist. He spent a long part of his life looking at ant species, describing hundreds of new species. And he believed that the more we could know about these species, the more we could protect them. So he was very much on board. But later in life, he also started doing the calculus and finding that we could continue to search for new species for 100 more years, and maybe we would start to get towards the end of finding new species. But by then it would be too late, that most of the species would go extinct before we ever even found them. He also was the grandfather of island biogeography, which is essentially the theory that large protected forests or islands they host many more species than small fragmented islands or islands that are far away from the mainland. This is also true about forests. So small fragmented forests host many fewer species. And so he took those concepts and he wrapped those up into his concept of half-Earth. And maybe you've heard about this concept, but it is the proposal is to protect half of the planet for biodiversity. So 50% of the land mass in the world and 50% of the oceans set aside for biodiversity. And he believed that if we did this, he said in this quote, he says, "The half-Earth proposal offers a first emergency solution commensurate with the magnitude of the problem," right? He knew that this is endgame strategy, that we're in a tough situation, and that if we did this, we could protect 80 to 85% of the species and ecosystems. And that would be good. That'd be good enough to sustain human life. It wouldn't be great, but it would get us there. Since he passed in 2021, it's been taken up in various ways, but the United Nations agreed to protect 30% of the planet by 2030 as a step towards half-Earth. And the Biden administration had an executive order to protect 30% of the United States by 2030. And these are great starting points. So when I think about protected areas, I think about our national parks. And for me, I think about the Great Smoky Mountains. So, so I guess I didn't introduce myself. I'm Nik Moy. My favorite national park is the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And I love the Great Smoky Mountains National Park because of its biodiversity. Obviously, it's the most biodiverse national park in the system. It's, if you're unfamiliar, it's 500,000 acres that straddles Tennessee and North Carolina. And it's a temperate rainforest. It has as much rain as the Pacific Northwest, but it's hot and steamy. It's a really incredible place. And because of that heat and rain, it's a hotbed for biodiversity. And so scientists have gotten in there and studied it. Something that's great about national parks is they're laboratories, right? And they found 19,000 species in the park. That's how many have been recorded, and they think there's many, many more. 1,500 flowering plants, 200 bird species call this place home. It's also the highest concentration of black bears per acre, and more salamander species than anywhere in the world. It's a very unique place. And so I thought, and also this is the most visited national park. 14 million visitors in 2022. And so with those combination of things, right, very popular park, amazing biodiversity, 500,000 acres towards 30 by 30, that this was a great starting point if I was going to start to try to connect science to conservation. So this brings me to my current position. As Bob was saying, I work for the National Parks Conservation Association, and this is a group that was formed alongside the national parks in 1919. And folks had the foresight to think that the parks would need a third-party advocate for their entire existence, that there would need to be advocates to fight for conservation within the parks, for the expansion of parks, for more funding, right? And so, also, while I started at NPCA, it was at the beginning of COVID, and like many Americans who all, during COVID, wanted to get outside and go to national parks, I did too. The numbers of visitation during COVID went through the roof during COVID at national parks. And I wanted to do the same, so I ended up buying a camper van and living in a camper van for 2 years and traveling around the West and visiting some of the most amazing, awe-inspiring places that our country has to offer. And here's some of those pictures. The top one's Yosemite. This is, the middle one is Gates of the Arctic in Alaska. And then that bottom one is Great Basin in Nevada, and some of the most awe-inspiring places. Now, while I got to travel around, it was also a really great opportunity for my work. I got to visit a lot of the landscapes that I was working in, and I got to meet a lot of my NPCA colleagues who are doing conservation on the ground, and really get to see what that's like and what it takes. And I found that they were doing conservation in such a collaborative way that it takes a lot of collaboration to make conservation happen. And they also showed me that parks are not islands, and people weren't thinking about them that way. that even though NPCA was built to protect what was in the boundaries, in order to protect what's in the boundaries of national parks, we have to protect the spaces around them. And this happens in several ways, things like air pollution that happen in sites off-site, and then the air comes into the park, right? The water that comes in and out of parks is directly related to maybe the oil and gas drilling that can happen right outside of a park. And then the wildlife, right? So in the Smoky Mountains, those black bears, they don't know where the park boundary is, right? And so there's a lot of road collisions right outside of the park. They try to travel across the highway right there. And so in order to protect the wildlife inside parks, the reason people come visit, they'd have to figure out a way to get those bears across the road, things that NPCA had been working on in various campaigns. And so we were finding that in order that the parks both relied on the landscapes around them, but those landscapes could also benefit from the star power of a national park. And so this whole time I'm thinking, how do we bring in science, right? So how does science play a role in these conversations? And so we started to think about this landscape question. Now here's a map. It's not the best map, but it has a circle where the Smoky Mountains is in this map, and you can see some fine white lines. That's the states, so Tennessee to the left, North Carolina to the right. And this large red blob on the map is what I've defined as my study area, okay? You can see that in that circle where the Smoky Mountains is, it's red. Now, the darker the red, the more imperiled species, right? This is the same data set we were looking at earlier. There's a lot of imperiled species in the park. There's also lots of imperiled species all around the park. In fact, there's some areas that are even darker red. Right? So we had the opportunity to use that star power of Smokies to protect more areas around the parks. This is the Teleco salamander, one of those many salamanders I was telling you about in the Smoky Mountains. It's a pretty cute little salamander, I think. It's also imperiled. And it relies on two ecosystems. This is a list of the ecosystems that are imperiled in this region. It relies on the Appalachian montane oak forest and the southern and central Appalachian cove forest, right? So this tells you a little bit of the story of why this species is imperiled, because its ecosystems are also imperiled, right? The habitat that it lives in is disappearing. And so using some of these big data, listening in on these conservation conversations, and trying to figure out how we could connect those two, we could start to bring in data sets to show more of the story. Now we know that the Teleco salamander is imperiled, right? So this, look at the right map first. This right map here, oh, I got a laser here. So the Smoky Mountains is right here. It's this green blob right in the middle. This is that study area I was telling you about. And you can see this light pink all around it. Now, some of that pink overlaps with the Smoky Mountains. This is the montane oak forest. This is what the salamander needs to live. But much of it exists outside of where the protected areas are. And so again, and then the same is true about the cove forest here, right? Some of it overlaps with the parks, some of it's outside of the parks. A lot of it's outside of the parks. So we could start to ask these questions. We could start to use data to inform how do we protect this salamander in the park? Well, we also need to start looking at some of these other areas in the landscape. So we started to take this model, this idea of a national park landscape with a national park core, bringing in all sorts of data to help the conservation conversations, and we started to expand this into all sorts of landscapes around the country. These are some of the study areas. There's 18 of them that I've been working through. And another one I want to tell you about, so I'm going to jump to this green spot right here. This is Aviquame. This is in the southern tip of Nevada. Now, this whole corridor you can see is green. This is all protected. But this space right here was not protected. This is an area called Aviquame, which is Mojave for Spirit Mountain. It's an important spiritual place for the tribes of the region. And the tribes have been working to protect this for a long time. And NPCA can get involved in these spaces to help empower the tribes and help think about ways to bring these into a new national monument. And so these conversations have been happening for years and years. Now, additionally, and I wasn't going to talk about this, but because of the big news yesterday, also in this region, right about here, this is the Grand Canyon, right? And to the left here, this is the Mojave Desert. For the Grand Canyon, there's another section of proposed protected areas here that is also very important to the tribes. It has hundreds of sacred sites, right? And so the tribes have been fighting for this. There's also, in this case, in the Grand Canyon case, a lot of uranium mining that's being proposed there. And so we wanted to both show that this could be one long connected landscape. On top of that, bring more science, more data, ways to convince people to protect these places into the picture. And so, we were able to connect some of the data here. This is that long connected corridor. And here's some of a climate flow data set that is from TNC. And so it shows that not only is this one large connected national park landscape, but that the data shows that this area, this is Avikome here, that this area is going to be really important in the next couple of years because of climate change, that species are going to have to use these corridors right here to move through the landscape. Now, last year, Avikome, and yesterday, the Grand Canyon National Monument were designated by the Biden administration. So 500,000 acres with Avikome and 1 million acres in the Grand Canyon. So all of these acreage numbers working towards that 30 by 30 goal and that half Earth, right? So these are the ways that we can connect science, national parks, and then protected lands. Okay, I'm gonna tell you about one more. This is Big Thicket. This is in southeast Texas. So you can see on the small map here, this dot is where it is in Texas. This is Big Thicket National Park, and it's an odd one because it has sort of along a river. It's lots of small fragmented pieces along the river. And as I was saying from E.O. Wilson, that small fragments don't do as well, don't have as many species. And so in the 90s, was the last time that this bird was seen there. So does anyone know what this bird is? Woodpecker, yes. This is the red cockaded woodpecker, is that what one said? All right, yeah, so the red cockaded woodpecker, yeah. So this species is, it needs a habitat that's longleaf pine habitat, and that was a pine habitat that went from Georgia all the way to Texas at one point, and a lot of it has been fragmented and has become timberlands. And with that was also the loss of the red cockaded woodpecker from the Big Thicket habitat. It's nearby, but it's not in the park. And now, we know the power of a national park, and that's very true in this space, right? This is outside of Houston. It's one of the only protected areas nearby that people can go visit. It's a big birding area. Folks come down just to see the birds, right? So there's a big economic driver for the local economies. And so there's a movement now to bring back the red cockaded woodpecker into the park. And, I think, my first thought is, why just one bird? Same questions we've been asking. But I think there's a power in some of these individual stories, the power of a single bird or a single park and what that can do for the landscape. And so they were bringing in biologists to go look on the ground. We helped them with new science and data using some NatureServe data, some USGS data. And this is a model of all of the potential habitat that is around the park for the red cockaded woodpecker, right? So everything in yellow here is suitable habitat. Not where it lives now, but we could show that if we protected some more areas around here, better place for the red cockaded woodpecker. But I wanted to go further. We brought in all of the species, like we were talking about, all of those imperiled species, climate models, climate flow and connectivity, like that blue graph I showed you for Avikome. And we could say for that whole study area, what were the highest conservation values in the landscape? We could connect all of those pieces, right? All of those data sets, and we could start to look at how all of those conservation values were important on the landscape. And if we protected these areas, that could be some of our highest quality, right? So part of the question of 30 by 30 is not just let's protect a ton of acreage, we want to protect really good acreage. And so we can use some of these models to help us do that. Now this data is brand new. We're using it as we speak with a lot of the partners on the ground. So I could bring this to the conversation and I could help share what are some priorities for new parcels, for timber companies we might go talk to, for farmers in the area, if we want to talk about their land, using lots of different data sets to talk about these things. And it was just one piece of the conversation, right? There's lots of folks on the ground who are doing this types of conservation. Slightly different from a big executive order. Oftentimes, conservation is happening parcel by parcel, And so having these data could help support that. This was, one of the ways that we hand off the data is in these large data packages that allow folks to visualize and add in data. Just another way to help folks who don't actually have access to this, right? So some of these local land trusts, volunteer run, they don't have access to a lot of these data, and we can bring them to them. All right, so that was a lot of data, so I'm gonna take a break. We're back. I just wanted to make a note that as I was traveling around and seeing how conservation was done, it was done quite like this. It was done with lots of teamwork and collaboration. In fact, it was about building trust and relationships. It happened slowly on the ground, and it took people from all different sectors. It also took lots of hard work, and it involved standing on the shoulders of lots of other people who have already put together these data sets. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can just bring all these things together. All right, so I was on my van trip, and I made it all the way to Alaska, and I had the opportunity to fly my parents up to come visit. It was one of the farthest they had ever been from their hometown. And I took them out to Kenai Fjords National Park, and we hiked out to the glacier there, and it's called Exit Glacier. And from the parking lot, you start to see these signs. I don't know if you haven't been to a glacier, this is pretty common at glaciers these days, but you start to see the signs for the years of where the glacier used to be. And they start all the way back at the parking lot in the Industrial Revolution, and you walk through time as you hike miles to get to the glacier, and you see the dates going up all the way to 2023, where the current glacier is. And you can see that we've lost miles of this glacier. It's a pretty impactful scene. And so while we were hiking, I was telling my mom about the work that I've been doing, the landscapes, that this was one of those landscapes that I had been working on. And, she didn't say, why is it important? She didn't say, what's next? In fact, this time she said, I'm sorry, which was sort of unusual for her. And she said that she was sorry that, her generation hadn't done enough, that maybe they didn't know enough, or maybe they knew enough and didn't do enough. And that it was up to our generation now, that she was sort of passing the buck. Now, I paused, and this was a little hard for me to square, because I had been talking with my friends and my generation. And they were also passing the buck. They felt like they were tired and that they were helpless in the situation, that maybe it was too late and that it wasn't their fight. So if the past generation doesn't feel like that it's their fight, they're passing the buck, and the current generation feels like it's not their fight, then where was the generation that was going to do something about it? The truth is that the science is clear that it's not too late. That if we act now, we can prevent the worst of climate change, we can prevent the worst of the sixth mass extinction. We have a North Star that is to protect half of the planet, and there are groups that are working on all of these things. I mean, it's been amazing to see just how many people work together to protect our spaces. We also have our national parks and other protected areas, thousands of acres. None of it is enough, right? The work is, so much more work is to be done. Now, I also wanted to say that the work that has to be done involves all different types of people, right? We need engineers and architects, we need other biologists, we need poets, we need everybody to be a part of the movement. And there's lots of ways you can do this, right? So I could say that, you could shut your lights off and you could recycle, but you are all probably doing these things already. But on top of that, you can get more involved. You can get involved with your local land trusts. You can share time, money, resources, land with these places, your expertise. You can sit on boards. You can volunteer. If you're in the workforce, there's many job boards. You can get involved in conservation today. And you can come find me afterwards for any of these resources. I'd love to share them. But I just wanted to say one last thing, which is that, if we all believe here that everyone holds a piece of the truth, then we each hold a piece of the responsibility.
Thank you, Nick. If you have a question, please come to the microphone so that we can record it. And the presentation that's being given today will be on our website in about 2 weeks. I want to mention a few announcements. Dr. Robert Davidson will talk about carbon, the key element of civilization, next week. I saw him somewhere. There. Okay. Thanks, Bob. And Mark, do you want to make any announcements? Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Not so much an announcement as just an expression of gratitude towards Nick. I worked for 16 years at the National Parks Conservation Association and started the climate change and landscape conservation programs there. And what Nick has been able to do and the rest of the staff there is just beyond my wildest hopes and dreams for conservation in our national parks and using them to expand outwards. And so, Nick, just proud of you and congratulations and thanks for all your great work.